If you've got a Bible and you find it helpful to turn it to the passage we're going to look at today, it's Luke chapter 9, and that's where we'll be today. This is a difficult passage for me. Difficult. I think anybody who can read this and read it dispassionately. I love what C.S. Lewis said. He said regarding the Bible and what Jesus said in the Bible. He said, anybody who reads Jesus' words overall and says they like them is a person that likes being hit in the hammer with a hammer in the forehead. I mean, and I think he's right. And this kind of text is not something that I would read for pleasure. So we'll start here today. It's a hard word to preach, and yet, you know what? Somehow we're supposed to find ourselves in it. So, Luke chapter 9, verse 23. Then Jesus said to all of them, if anybody would come after me, they've got to deny themselves and take up their cross daily and follow me. Whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for my sake will save it. What good is it for anyone to gain the whole world and yet lose or forfeit their very soul? If anyone's ashamed of my words, the Son of Man will be ashamed of them when he comes into his glory and in the glory of the Father and the holy angels. Now, I just don't see how that text can be a pleasant text for anybody to read. It's not for me. He talks about us, he talks about us as disciples, which we are. And the word disciple, by the way, the best translation of that word for you and I is apprentice, an apprentice. In the fact that we're not just learners. Disciples are learners, but we're supposed to be practicing as we go. Jesus is headed for Jerusalem, and his life is taking a big turn right now. No longer is he just out doing his ministry around the Lake Galilee. He's now headed for Jerusalem, and he knows what's coming. It's in his last week of life. He knows he's headed for the cross and death. And when Jesus uses this metaphor for these guys, take up your cross every day and follow me, for them it had a radically different meaning than it has for us. Radically different. He would have understood the cross well. These guys are living in the Roman Empire in the first century. The Romans crucified tens of thousands of people. Every year people were crucified, and there was no place in the Roman Empire where at some point in a person's life, if they lived a normal life, that they didn't walk past crucified people. So they knew exactly what Jesus was speaking to. As a matter of fact, when Jesus was about 11 years old, there was a Galilean named Judas of Galilee who claimed to be the Messiah. You know, this whole time in history, the Jews, all of them are looking for the coming Messiah, the Christ, the one who's going to deliver Israel. They're looking for it. They know that this is the right time. And so this person said, I'm the guy. And several thousand Jews followed him. Well, the Romans have absolutely no patience with anything that looks like a rebellion. They will squash it because they want to send a message to anybody else who thinks you can take on the Roman Empire. They did it in all of their outward provinces. If Germany or Britain or any of the outer provinces decide, because they're way off from Rome, right? I mean, 1,000 miles from Rome. Go out there and try to raise up a rebellion. Get your country out from under the boot of Rome and see what happens. They'll send them. And when they come, they're merciless. Absolutely merciless. They want a message sent. If you'll stay with Rome, things will go well. If you try to leave, we're going to make it really difficult for you for a long time. And that's exactly what happened. Sepphoris was a little town about 4 miles from Nazareth where Jesus grew up. And that's where Judas the Galilean and his band of about 3,000 or 4,000 Jews raided the Roman armory at Sepphoris and took weaponry and raised a rebellion. And the Romans crucified 2,000 people. Said, don't do this again. Now, think about Jesus working in his dad's carpenter shop 4 miles away. They burned Sepphoris. The Romans burned the whole town to the ground. The whole town. I guarantee you that Jesus and Joseph as carpenters found work in Sepphoris as Sepphoris was rebuilt. I'll bet you, when we say that Jesus was a carpenter, we picture somebody with a hammer and a chisel and dowels and all kinds of things like that. Carpenters in the first century didn't just work with wood. Stone is the more plentiful material, and they worked with stone as well, and metal. I guarantee you that right now there are artifacts, if somebody were to dig, that are found in the Sepphoris area that probably Jesus and Joseph in their carpenter shop produced. They're there. Well, you noticed remember last week when Jesus asked the disciples, who do people say I am? And they gave all these answers. And finally Peter says, you are the Christ. Jesus said, don't tell anybody. This is why. Because to tell that to the people after Jesus has done all these miracles. See, Judas the Galilean just said, oh, I'm the Christ, and he got a following. He didn't do any of these miracles. Jesus does all these miracles. And if it were found out that he was really the Christ, and people would have followed Jesus, they're already following him. Thousands of people are following him. There would have been a rebellion, and Jesus knows that. So that's why he said, don't say anything about it. But then let's think about this metaphor that Jesus uses here when he says, take up your cross every day and follow me. Think how those disciples heard that. I mean, they've walked past crosses in their life with people hanging on them. Some dying, some dead, some rotting, some people being nailed to them as they walk by. They understand this idea of a cross totally different than we do. Think about what we do with crosses. Think about it. Some people wear a cross around their neck as an ornament. I'm not saying that's bad. I'm just saying that's what we do, right? We don't see it as anything big. Or somebody might have a cross on their bumper as part of their bumper sticker ornamentation on their car. Or you've got people like Madonna. Rock and roll stars wear crosses, all kinds of crosses, cross earrings, cross medallions, crosses on their guitars, crosses on all kinds of stuff, and people think nothing of it. And it can really be, and I'm not saying any of this is bad. All I'm saying is you and I just don't have a picture of what a cross is. In this perspective, it can mean that a person is a follower of Jesus. It can mean that. I knew an evangelist and an apologist who wore a great big wooden one all the time. And this guy, this was his whole life, was following the Lord and preaching and teaching. That's what he did. But it doesn't mean to us an instrument of execution. Think for a moment. Now, I'm not trying to make fun of this. I'm really not. I'm just trying to get us to think in a different grid. Think if you and I were to wear a silver electric chair as a medallion. Right? That would be the kind of or a silver lethal injection table, or a syringe that they use for the lethal injection. I mean, this is so for the people in the first century who are following Jesus, when he says take up your cross, it meant something pretty severe to them. They understood this in a totally different way than we do. And so this was a hard word for them. Every bit as hard as it is for us today. And you'll notice something about this in this, if you read the whole text of Luke chapter 9 from the confession forward, there's no transition here. Jesus talks about who do people say that I am, and he moves right into this, take up your cross and follow me. There's no transition. He doesn't stop everything and say, I've got something really hard I want to say to you. He just pulls it all into one big thought, and it spills out, and the disciples take it in. What he's doing is he's defining discipleship for every human being who's going to follow him. Now, I remember when I was a kid, and you all have heard this story probably until now it's time to take a nap, but I was forced to go to church, and I hated it. I hated it. I hated it with a passion, because no air conditioning, 3-piece suit, hated the suit. My parents weren't believers. They were clearly didn't care anything about what, as a matter of fact, complained about the fact that we were going. I picked up on that. I thought, well, then it's no good. Why are we going at all? But we were forced to go every Sunday. And I'll never forget being in a Sunday school class. I might have been 12 or 13 years old, and there was this girl in there named Beverly. Can't remember. I can see her face if I close my eyes, but I can't remember her last name. And Beverly, from the time I knew her in Sunday school until she went, wanted to be a missionary in Africa. That's what she wanted to do all of her life. I remember thinking to myself, I was old enough to put the pieces of all this together, and I knew enough about listening to the Sunday school lessons and listening to the preacher on Sunday that I didn't want to go to Africa. I didn't want to go to Brazil. I didn't want to go to Alaska. I didn't want to go anywhere that was hard and scary and bad. And if I become a Christian, well, that's what Jesus is going to make me do. That's exactly, and not wanting to be in church too, it was a rough combination to get past for me. That's how I looked at it. And when I read a text like this, all those memories come back to me. This is a hard word to hear for anybody. I don't care how long somebody's been a believer. This is a hard word. But there was an error in my thinking, a big error that I had no awareness of. If a person doesn't know Jesus, then a word like this conjures up those kinds of feelings of what's God going to make me do that I don't want to do. But the error in my thinking was I was looking at what Beverly was doing as a personal choice, not as a calling. I didn't see it as something that God would make her inside such that she couldn't not do that. That it was so much a passion for her that God had given her that passion. And you know something about that that's so striking? If God gives somebody a passion, whatever that passion is, for a calling, they will be unable to be satisfied any other way. There is no satisfaction to be found outside of what God would call somebody to do and be. And it doesn't seem at all like something scary or burdensome at that point. Beverly didn't think so. She went. She wound up going to Africa as a missionary. I remember her standing in front of the church and being commissioned. She was a little older than I. So she reached an age where she was being sent off to language school. Where she went in Africa, what she did there other than be a missionary, whatever that meant. At that time, my mind didn't have any way to put those things together. I have no idea, but she went. Because for her, to do anything else would have been totally unsatisfying. You see, when we say yes to Jesus, we're not saying yes to a cause. This is not like world peace or save the planet or anything like that. We're saying yes to a person. And we're doing it in response to who he is. We're not doing it in response to something that we look out there and say, well, I'd like to do that or I'd like to do this. Jesus will make sure that the things that we want to do, he will give us. And there'll be things we really want to do. They won't be things that seem a burden to us at all. People back then, you remember last week, they said, oh, he's a prophet, he's Elijah, he's this, he's that. Peter got it right. Peter didn't understand what it meant. And again, I just think we don't understand what it means. When we say Jesus is the Christ, who is he in terms of who we're supposed to be? He's calling everybody all the time. All of us are called to live. And this idea of losing our life to save it is not something we just have to grit our teeth and make happen. I promise. If you and I say yes to Jesus and we ask Jesus to take us and use us, he will. And it won't seem like something we just have to grit our teeth and make happen. It'll seem like this is the only thing I want to do in my life. Now, in our Christian culture today, there's some dissonance here. And that's because we don't really think about following Jesus in these terms. We think about it in terms of, I like the music. Right? Or the decorations are nice in the church. Or I like the way he preaches or she preaches. Or I like the way they do Sunday school. You hear this said. We'll hear this said very frequently. I get something out of that. I got something out of that. I'm not saying any of that's wrong. What I am saying is there's a big difference between saying I want to follow Jesus and then looking at it as an enhancement for this life here on this earth. Because it's not. It's not. Now for Beverly, it was an enhancement, but not in the sense of her choosing a career. She was called to go do that. And so for her, she would have been utterly miserable if she didn't follow that calling that she had received. This is the distinction. If you and I come to Jesus and say, Jesus, come into me, live in me, forgive me. I want to belong to you. Accept me into your family, Lord. And we get born again. That idea of losing our life to save it doesn't really occur to us any longer. Because God is going to give us the callings. He's going to pull us out. I look at these guys here. I looked at Beverly back then, but I look at these guys and I think, these guys are just a lot tougher than me. I think they're just tougher. I mean, look at all the stuff they do. Jesus, when the night that he comes walking on the water, they've been out there in that boat all night long. They've already had a whole day of being awake, and now they're in the 3 o'clock in the morning, and they're still rowing a boat. I just think, man, these guys, all I've got to have is one, ask anybody that knows me well. Monday, when I got up to get Jackson to the doctor in Valdosta, I'd had 2 hours of sleep. That's all it takes for me. I'm done. I'm not going to be the person who's going to be salt and light and kind and considerate and anything else. I'm done. That's all it takes. Or something hurts. And I'm in a tailspin, I'm crashing and burning. As far as being a disciple, that's just the farthest thing from my mind. And yet, it's in those moments that we're called to be the disciple the most. Because then the challenge has come. I've got a friend of mine who says, Rip, I don't like to camp. I said, well, I don't like to camp either. He says to me, I love this phrase. He says, roughing it for me is really slow room service. That's me. Warm shower, air conditioning, soft bed, that's all the good stuff I like. I don't care anything about going out laying on the ground in a tent. And I sure don't care about having to get up in the middle of the night to go to the restroom out of doors. None of that seems like fun to me. These disciples, man, that was their life. These guys were tough. But they weren't tough just because they were tough. They were tough because they were called. King Charlemagne, they dug him up. The king, 250 years or so after King Charlemagne, there was King Otto. King Charlemagne in England was known as the first real European king. I don't know if you're aware of that. The Britons were seen as barbarians by Rome. They were just seen as wild people. But by the time of King Charlemagne, they were becoming a European country. Charlemagne was a devout believer. And when they dug him up, they found the people that buried him, I don't understand this. I hope they don't do anything like that with me. But they buried him by putting him on a throne. They strapped him up to the throne because, of course, when you're dead, you can't sit up very well. They put the crown on his head, and he was sitting there with a Bible in his hand. This is all true. They dug him up, and they guess where his finger was? This passage we're reading today. This passage we're reading today. So what does this mean for you and me to pick up a cross and carry it? I think the world will give us our answer, right? The world will tell us what we have to do to carry a cross, because we're going to go out of here, and if we're a follower of Jesus, we're going to encounter this fallen world, and it's going to tell us how to be salt and light and what it is to be a disciple. This day, today, when we leave here, we'll be informed. And it's not the big stuff. It's the little stuff. The tiniest things. This world gives us all chances to do things that are wrong. And we know they're wrong. They defy our conscience. We know it. A little fudge of the books, so that the taxes aren't so big. Nobody will know. Conceal this. say that to somebody just to get them off our back. We do that all the time. Nobody's going to confront us about it. But those are the opportunities that you and I are being given to be a disciple, to take up the cross. That's what he's talking about. What are we doing wherein every aspect of who we are, that we're willing to submit that to who he calls us to be? And if we're willing, the world will bring us those places where we're going to be confronted, and we have to make a choice. We have to make a choice to say yes to Jesus and to follow him. There's a woman by the name of Annie Johnson Flint. You may not know who she is. She wrote hymns. She wrote poetry. She went off to school to be a school teacher in her teens. Back then you could go to college, 16 years old. She went to college, got her teaching certification, came back, started teaching. And then all of a sudden she found her hands were hurting. Went to the doctor. Next thing her neck was hurting. Next thing her back started hurting. Then her knees, then her ankles. And pretty soon, at 20 years old, she was bedridden. They said, you've got a form of arthritis. It's going to become progressively worse. You're going to be bedridden the rest of your life. Annie Johnson Flint, who had been twice orphaned. Her parents died. Then the people that her parents gave Annie Johnson Flint and her sister to live with, they died when she was a child. She was orphaned twice. Had this incredibly paralyzing debilitation. And she wrote this hymn. I'll just recite it for you. I can't recite it from memory. I'll have to read it. He giveth more grace when the burdens grow greater. He sendeth more strength when the labors increase. To added afflictions he adds his mercy. To multiplied trials his multiplied peace. When we've exhausted our store of endurance, when our strength has failed, though the day is half done, when we reach the end of our hoarded resources, our Father's full giving has only begun. His love has no limit. His grace has no measure. His power no boundary known unto men. For out of his infinite riches in Jesus, he giveth and giveth and giveth again. So when God calls us, we don't have to do it by ourselves. We're not going to have to just grit our teeth and make ourselves disciples. If you and I want to be a disciple of Jesus, all we've got to do is ask him. He'll make it happen. And he'll give us everything we need in order to do it. And it won't seem like a burden. And it won't seem like something that we've just got to endure. It'll seem like the only thing in this world that we really want to do. I don't know where everybody is today, but if I've said anything about which you've got a question,